The river had been keeping that boat for 19 years when Cora Vane arrived to claim it. She was 26 years old, standing at the edge of a mud-gray landing in the spring of 1887 with $41 and a set of copper gauges wrapped in flannel tucked beneath her arm. The levee at Pelican Reach, Louisiana, smelled of river silt and rotting rope and the faint chemical tang of old boiler scale. She had traveled 3 days by rail and 1 by wagon to reach this bend in the Atchafalaya, and she stood now looking down at what the notice in the New Orleans shipping register had called, in language so clipped it seemed embarrassed, a partially submerged stern-wheel passenger vessel of 180-foot length, believed formerly registered as the Lacroix Brothers Line steamer Evangeline Claire, title disputed, offered for recovery auction in the matter of the Lacroix Brothers Line receivership, starting bid $50. No one else had come. The auctioneer, a man named Prudhomme with liver-spotted hands and a coat that had survived 2 presidencies, had ridden out from the parish seat the night before. He looked at Cora, looked at the river, looked at the vessel tilted 15 degrees into the bank with her wheelhouse half beneath the waterline, and he said with the flat courtesy of a man who has seen queerer things and preferred not to say so, "The bid stands open, miss." Cora said she would take it at the starting figure and did not wait for him to argue. She signed the transfer receipt on the hood of his wagon, paid $40 of what she had, and walked back to the bank alone. She hadn't come to float it. She had come to read it. If you have ever stood at the edge of a river in the hour before the light goes and watched a thing that once moved under steam sit perfectly still in the current while the water presses past it, you know the particular quality of that silence. It is not the silence of something dead. It is the silence of something waiting. She knew that silence well. She had grown up listening to it in her father's machine room in Shreveport, where the gauges did not speak until you understood what they were measuring, and patience was not a virtue so much as a technical requirement. Her father, Amos Vane, had spent 30 years as a steam plant engineer for the Sabine River Shipping Company before his lungs gave out in the winter of 1883. He had taught Cora to read a pressure gauge when she was 9 years old, to crack a valve seat when she was 12, to identify the signature sounds of a compromised boiler flue by ear before she was 15. He had taught her the way mechanics teach, not through explanation, but through demonstration and correction. The same motion repeated until the hands knew it without the mind's permission. When he died, he left her his tools and his notebooks and a debt to the boarding house where he had spent his last 6 weeks, and nothing else. She had worked 3 years as a repair hand for a steam laundry in Shreveport after his death, one of 2 women on a floor of 12, and the only one who could retime the drive belt without stopping the drum. She had saved carefully. She had read the shipping registers carefully, the way her father taught her to read any system, looking for the anomaly, the number that did not agree with the surrounding numbers, the gap where something should have been recorded and was not. She had found the Evangeline Claire in the registers not once but twice. The first entry, dated April 1866, listed her as a 180-foot stern-wheel packet, 3 decks, compound steam plant, registered to the Lacroix Brothers Line out of New Orleans, operating the Red River trade between Alexandria and Shreveport. The second entry, dated September 1868, listed her as sunk in the Atchafalaya during the flood of that year. Total loss, accounts settled. Between those 2 dates, Cora had found a third entry in a different register, one kept not by the shipping authority, but by the Pelican Parish Land Office. In handwriting she had to read with a magnifying glass in the reading room of the New Orleans Public Library. It was a manifest filed by the Lacroix Brothers Line purser, a man named Aldous Ferris, in July of 1868, 2 months before the sinking. It itemized, in the precise, dry language of a man who had spent his life responsible for other people's property, the full inventory of ship's documents aboard the Evangeline Clare at the time of her last departure from the Alexandria levee. Among them, described without emphasis, as though they were simply items to be accounted for, and nothing more, were 47 individual passenger account ledgers covering the years 1866 and 1867, one company deed register, and a sealed document envelope addressed to the Lacroix brothers themselves. The shipping company's receivership records, filed in 1871, made no reference to any of these documents. The receiver listed them as lost with the vessel. They were not lost with the vessel. The purser had filed them before departure. Someone had decided afterward that they had never existed. Cora had spent 4 months thinking about that gap before she came south to stand on the levee at Pelican Reach and look at the steamer that was now legally hers. The vessel had sunk bow first into the bend on the bankside, which meant her stern and her wheelhouse were partly above the waterline, and her bow was deep. Her main deck was tilted but continuous. The flood of 1868 had pushed her sideways into the bank mud rather than rolling her, and 19 years of river silt had filled in around her hull in a way that, Cora had noted in the register, had actually stabilized her somewhat. The Atchafalaya did not give things back quickly, but it did not always destroy them either. The first morning she spent in assessment. She had learned from her father that a machine you intend to enter deserves the same respect as a machine you intend to operate. You do not climb inside a boiler without first reading the pressure, and you do not step onto a sunken vessel without first reading the hull. She unrolled her flannel kit on the levee grass and selected the wrench she had used for tapping hull work since she was 13, a 12-inch cast-iron piece with a hexagonal head that rang clean and carried the return sound better than any of the others. She waded out along the bankside, knee-deep in the river shallows, and tapped the hull planking at intervals of roughly 2 feet, listening. She was listening for rot hollow, the sound of a board that had given way behind its surface. A solid board returned the tap with a short, high ring. A compromised one absorbed the sound and returned something softer, closer to a knock. Her father had told her once that you could feel the difference in the handle before you fully heard it, the way a hollow space pulls the vibration down instead of returning it. She had thought he was exaggerating until the 3rd or 4th hull she worked, after which she understood that he was simply describing something that had to be felt before it could be believed. She worked from the water's edge upward, tapping and listening, her skirts knotted at her hip, the river current pressing lightly against her legs. She found 3 boards amidships that gave the soft thud of advanced rot. She noted their positions relative to the forward freight door frame and left them and continued. The rest of the hull from the waterline upward rang solid. 19 years of river submersion, having done what river submersion does to sound timber. Compressed and darkened the grain, but not broken it. The wood had the color of old pewter and the texture of something that had been tested and had passed. She pulled herself up the rope she had tied around the wheel hub the evening before and stood on the tilted main deck, steadying herself against the list. The wood was slick with algae. The cabin structures above the main deck had fared better than the hull. The Evangeline Clare had gone down fast, and her above waterline sections had been above the worst of the silt. 19 years of weather had peeled her paint to gray wood and rusted her ironwork to a deep reddish brown that in the morning light looked almost warm, as though the metal remembered the heat it once carried. She did not start with the hold. She started with the purser's office. Every packet steamer of the Evangeline Clare's size and era carried a purser's cabin on the main deck, amidships on the upstream side, positioned so that the purser could watch the freight doors and the passenger gangway simultaneously. It was a practical location chosen by practical men, and it meant that the purser's cabin on a vessel that had gone down bow first into a riverbank was one of the highest and driest points on the remaining accessible structure. Cora had worked this out from the register dimensions before she arrived. She had calculated the angle of the sinking from the tide level marks she could read on the remaining wheelhouse posts. The purser's cabin, by her estimate, had never been more than intermittently awash and had been above the waterline for most of the 19 years. She found the cabin door on the port side, wedged shut by the list of the deck. The handle was a brass lever, green with oxide but structurally sound. She worked at the hinge pins first, the ones her father had taught her to assess before the handle, because a door that opens outward on a listed vessel will either swing free or swing against you, and either way you want to know before you commit your weight. The lower hinge pin had corroded solid. The upper one moved with persuasion. She set her shoulder to the door frame, not the door, and pushed at the frame while pulling the upper pin, and the door came free of its lower hinge and swung on the upper pin as though on a pivot, slowly with the low groan of 19 years of pressure releasing, until it hung at an angle that let her step through into the cabin beyond. The air that came out was not the smell she expected. She had expected bilge, mildew, river mud. She found instead something closer to dust and old paper and the faint resinous ghost of linseed oil, the way a room smells when it has been sealed long enough that even the damp has gone dry. The cabin was dark except for what came through 2 porthole windows on the far wall, both of them above the waterline and intact. One of them was cracked at the sealant, which had admitted a thin trace of moisture over the years, enough to streak one wall with a dark stain down to the baseboard. The rest of the cabin was intact. She stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes settle. The purser's desk was bolted to the deck, as all furniture on a working river packet was bolted, and it had stayed. The desk chair had slid with the list into the downstream corner. The shelving above the desk was also bolted, the kind of heavy-lipped shelving designed for a moving vessel, and the lips had done their work. Several large ledger books sat on the shelf above the desk, leaned to port with the angle of the floor, but present. The shelf below them held a wooden document box with a hinged lid, the wood darkened with age, and on the desktop, beneath a brass paperweight in the shape of a pelican that had tarnished to a dull gold green, was a sheaf of papers that had bent under their own weight across 19 years, but hadn't disintegrated. Cora put her hand flat on the desk and stood still, listening to the river moving around the hull. She thought about what her father had told her the first time she read a gauge incorrectly. The instrument does not lie. What you are reading is real. The error is in what you expected it to say. She lifted the brass pelican and set it aside and picked up the sheaf of papers. They were what she had thought they might be, if she allowed herself to think it, which she had mostly avoided doing on the 3-day train journey and the wagon ride, and the 2 mornings she had spent tapping hull planking and calculating cabin angles. They were the accounting records for the Evangeline Clare's final season, written in the careful, precise hand of a man who had spent his working life being accountable for things that belonged to other people. The name on the inside cover of the top ledger, written in that same hand, was a Ferris, purser. She did not stay in the cabin to read them. She wrapped the sheaf in the oilcloth she had brought for exactly this possibility, and carried it carefully to the bank. That afternoon, sitting with her back to an oak tree at the edge of the levee road, she spread the oilcloth across her knees and opened the first ledger and began. She started with the oldest one, for the year 1866, and worked forward. Ferris's handwriting was consistent throughout, the hand of a man who had been writing in ledgers for a very long time, and did not vary his letter forms under pressure. He recorded passenger tallies by departure date and route, noting the fare collected per passenger class and the freight weight and charges for each cargo consignment. The figures were precise and included the corrections he had made when a number had to be altered. Each correction crossed with a single line, the corrected figure written beside it, and both initialed. Nothing had been erased. A man who erases his errors is a man who would prefer not to be questioned about them. Ferris had not erased a single entry in 3 ledgers spanning 2 years. The Lacroix brothers' line had been carrying passenger accounts since 1866 on a commission structure that required them to remit a portion of each fare to the Red River Shipping Trust, a cooperative formed by 5 independent operators in that year, to share maintenance facilities and levy charges. The remittance records, which Ferris had copied into his own ledger as a matter of personal professional discipline, showed 2 parallel sets of figures on facing pages. The left page carrying the actual passenger tallies and fares collected, the right carrying the figures that the Lacroix brothers had reported to the trust. The reported figures were consistently and materially lower, not by accident and not by rounding, lower by specific amounts that did not correspond to any adjustment or fee she could identify in the trust's published rate schedule. For the year 1866 alone, the shortfall was $812. For 1867, it was $1,340. She set both ledgers in her lap and looked at the river for a moment, at the hull of the Evangeline Clare, tilting into the bank, and the water moving past it without interest. And then she turned to the last pages of the second ledger, where Ferris had copied his own letter to the trust's administrator, sent in August of 1868. It was a careful letter that named the discrepancy by the numbers and enclosed a summary of his figures. He had noted in the margin beside the copy, "Copies filed aboard vessel pending response." Ferris had received no reply for 3 weeks. He had written a second letter, which he had also copied into the ledger, this one shorter and more precise, naming the specific pages and figures and asking for acknowledgement of receipt. No reply came to that one either. He had filed his copies aboard the vessel and waited. 2 months later, the Evangeline Clare left Alexandria on what was recorded as a regular freight run to Shreveport and sank in the Atchafalaya during what the official report described as an unexpected rise in water level. Cora had read that official report in the New Orleans library. She had noted, without saying anything to anyone, that September of 1868 had not been a month of unusual flooding on the Atchafalaya. The river had been at seasonal normal. The sinking had not been recorded as a collision, a fire, or a mechanical failure. It had been recorded very briefly as a flood event, and the accounts had been settled without investigation. The response, apparently, had been the sinking of the vessel. Cora sat with the ledger in her lap and the oilcloth spread beneath it, and thought for a long time about Aldous Ferris, who had spent his career being careful and honest with other people's money, and had sealed his careful, honest records in the one place where the river would keep them for him, and then walked away from a dock he never returned to. She did not know what had become of him. She would find out. She made camp that night at the edge of the levee. She had a small fire built from driftwood, and her flannel-wrapped tools in the oilcloth bundle, which she wedged under the roots of the oak tree before she slept. She did not sleep quickly. She lay looking up through the live oak canopy at the river stars and thought about the word deliberate, the word Ferris had not used but which explained every decision visible in those ledgers. He had not hidden the records in haste. He had filed the manifest with the land office in July. He had written his letters and copied them. He had sealed the document box and locked it with a padlock whose maker he would have known well. And then he had placed it on a shelf designed to hold things against the motion of a working river. He had understood that a vessel going down on the bankside, in the shallows, was a vessel that would rest rather than sink and scatter. He had known his own ship, and he had trusted the purser's cabin, the driest and most stable point on the vessel's accessible structure, to do what it was built to do. He had been right about all of it. The river moved past the hull of the Evangeline Clare in the dark, and the hull moved slightly with the current, just enough to be heard as a low rhythmic creak against the mud that held her. The sound wasn't unpleasant. It was the sound of something that had been pressed hard and hadn't given way. She was back on the vessel by first light the next morning. She had not finished with the document box. The document box on the lower shelf was locked with a small brass padlock of the kind used on personal correspondence and strong boxes throughout the river trade in those years. She recognized the maker's style from her father's files, a brand out of Cincinnati whose lock cylinders had a characteristic quirk. The tumblers ran in a sequence of 3 and not 4, which made them easier to service but also faster to read. She did not pick it because picking locks was not something she had learned. She removed the hinge pins on the box's lid instead, working at them with the narrow drift punch her father had given her when she was 15, the one with his initials stamped into the handle. The hinge pins came free in 10 minutes, and she lifted the lid from its hinges and set it aside. Inside the box were 3 things: a leather-bound register, narrow and long, of the kind used for deed and title recording, a sealed envelope, the paper yellowed and the wax seal bearing an embossed design she could not immediately identify, and a single folded letter, unaddressed, written in the same careful hand as the ledger records. She read the letter first. It was from Aldous Ferris to whoever might find these documents, and it was dated the 3rd of September, 1868, which, by the shipping log she had read, was 2 days before the Evangeline Clare's final departure from Alexandria. He wrote that he had reason to believe the vessel would not complete her voyage. He wrote that he did not know the means by which this would occur. He wrote that he had copied into the ledger she would find alongside this letter every passenger manifest and freight record from the Evangeline Clare's operation, and that these records would show what the Lacroix Brothers line had withheld from the Red River Shipping Trust over a period of 26 months, and further what monies had been collected from 41 specific freight consignors and not remitted per contractual obligation. He named each of the 41. He named the dollar amounts. He ended by writing that he was leaving his position aboard the vessel at Alexandria and traveling overland to Natchitoches, where he had family, and that if anyone found this box and found the figures inside it to be what he believed them to be, he would welcome the opportunity to testify accordingly. He had signed it with the same careful precision with which he had signed every page of every ledger. Aldous Ferris, Purser, Evangeline Clare, Lacroix Brothers line, late. Cora read the word late and understood it as he had meant it. He had written it knowing he was already gone from that vessel and that the life he had built around it was finished. He was naming himself accurately, the former purser of a vessel he expected to be sunk, leaving a record for the river to keep. She sat in the purser's cabin for a long time after that, with the list of the deck and the distant sound of the river and the dust that moved in the shaft of light from the porthole. The brass pelican paperweight sat on the corner of the desk where she had replaced it, and the light caught its surface and held there a moment, the way it holds on metal things of a certain age, not glinting but glowing, the light absorbed and given back at a different temperature. She opened the leather-bound register next. It was narrower than the ledgers, the kind used for deed and contract recording, and its entries covered only a single year, 1866 through early 1867. Each page recorded a specific cargo consignment, the consignor's name, the nature of the freight, the declared weight and value, the agreed carriage fee, and the signature of the party releasing the goods to the Lacroix Brothers line at departure. The signatures varied. Some were commercial stamps, some were careful cursive names, some were the crossed marks of men who had been told, "This is where you sign," and had done so without reading. 41 names in all, spread across 47 pages. Aldous Ferris had made a small notation in pencil beside each one, a number referencing the corresponding entry in his parallel ledger, linking the record of what was received to the record of what was never forwarded. She held the sealed envelope last. The wax was dark brown, nearly black, and bore an embossed seal she finally identified after studying it for several minutes as the Lacroix brothers' own commercial mark, the stylized double L that appeared on their freight documentation. Ferris had not opened it. He had filed it with the other documents and noted its existence in his manifest and said nothing further about it in his letter. She looked at it for a long moment, then wrapped it carefully in a separate fold of the oilcloth. Whatever was in it belonged to the Carriers Association's proceedings, not to her private reading. She thought about what testimony was worth after 19 years. She thought about what a record was worth when the company it had been filed against had entered receivership and its principals were either dead or dispersed. She thought about the 41 freight consignors Aldous Ferris had named, and whether any of their successors or heirs or business partners were still operating, and whether 19 years was long enough for a theft of that scale to have been fully absorbed, or whether somewhere in the ledgers of Louisiana commerce there was still an accounting to be done. She thought carefully about the difference between a wrong that could be set right and a wrong that could only be named. She did not know yet which of those applied here. She knew only that the documents were real, that the figures in them were real, and that they had been put in this particular place by a careful man who trusted that the right kind of attention would eventually find them. She thought about attention. Her father had talked about it often in the years when she was learning the machinery, and what he said was not that you had to be smart to read a system, but that you had to be willing to look at what was there, rather than what you expected. Most of the errors he had seen in his 30 years, he told her, had been made not by ignorant men, but by careful ones who had stopped looking because they thought they already knew the answer. She had tried to remember that in the library reading room in New Orleans, in the rows of shipping registers with their pale blue covers, not looking for confirmation of what she suspected, but looking at every number in sequence and writing down what was there. What was there had been enough. She climbed down from the vessel at midday and walked 3 miles along the levee road to the nearest settlement, a river town called Coteau Brule, with a single commercial street and a telegraph office that shared its counter with a dry goods store. The woman behind the counter had a name she did not offer, and a manner that suggested she had transmitted a great deal of other people's urgent business, and did not require an explanation of this instance. Cora wrote out both messages in her careful, steam plant engineer's hand, the same precision her father had used when he logged readings, nothing imprecise, nothing left open to interpretation. The first telegram went to the successor office of the Red River Shipping Trust, which had reorganized in 1873 and continued to operate under a different name. She named the Lacroix brothers line, named the receivership date, named the vessel, and stated that documents recovered from the vessel bore on unreported revenues during the 1866 to 1867 operating season, and that she would welcome contact from a representative. The second went to a man named Ferris in Natchitoches, the name taken from the parish directory she had found in the dry goods store, on the chance that Aldous Ferris had arrived safely in that town 19 years ago, and still had people there who could confirm it. She walked back to the levee and spent the rest of the afternoon in the purser's cabin, reading every page of every ledger in the document box, copying the figures she needed into her own notebook with the stub of a pencil she sharpened with her pocket knife. When the light through the porthole went orange, she stopped and wrapped everything in the oilcloth again and took it back to the bank. The reply telegrams arrived the following morning, delivered by a rider from Coteau Brule. The first was from the Shipping Trust's successor, a cooperative now called the Atchafalaya and Red River Carriers Association. They were aware of the Lacroix brothers' receivership. They had not been aware of any dispute regarding reported freight revenues. They were interested in what she had found and would send a representative. The second was from a woman named Opal Ferris in Natchitoches. It said, in the abbreviated grammar of the Telegraph, "Father alive, 71, in this house." What is this about? Cora wrote back to both. To the Carriers Association, she described the documents and their location. To Opal Ferris, she wrote a longer message, more expensive by the word, explaining who she was and what she had found aboard the vessel and what the name Aldous Ferris meant to it. The representative from the Carriers Association arrived on the third day, a compact and deliberate man named Holland, who wore a brown suit and carried a leather satchel, and looked at the tilted hull of the Evangeline Clare with the careful expression of a man who has learned not to show what he is thinking until he has finished thinking it. He spent 2 hours in the purser's cabin with the ledgers, sitting on the tilted desk chair with the documents spread across the desk, and he did not speak much while he read, only occasionally marking a figure in his own notebook. When he came back to the bank, he stood next to Cora and said, "These are real." She said she knew that. He said, "The trust's board will need to convene. There are claims here that are time-barred by statute and claims that may not be. The freight consignors on this list, or their successors, have a case that is worth examining." She said she understood. She said she wanted nothing from the proceeding except a certified copy of the purser's ledgers for her own files, and acknowledgement in the trust's records that the documents had been delivered intact by her. Holland looked at her. He said, "That is an unusual position." She said, "It is the right one." She asked about Aldous Ferris. Holland said he would leave that to the board's counsel, who would want his testimony if it could be obtained. Aldous Ferris arrived at Pelican Reach 10 days later. He came by wagon from Natchitoches with his daughter Opal, a forthright woman of 40 with her father's careful eyes and none of his patience for silence. Opal did most of the talking for the first hour, explaining the journey, the state of the road, her father's health, the shock of receiving Cora's telegram, the longer shock of understanding what it meant. She was not complaining. She was processing, the way a person processes when they have spent a long time in proximity to a grief they were never allowed to name because there was nothing concrete enough to grieve. Aldous himself stood at the edge of the levee, looking at the hull of the Evangeline Clare for a long time, without speaking. He was a small man, white-haired, with the careful, stooped posture of someone who had spent decades bent over a desk, and the river light caught his face at a particular angle, and Cora saw in it what 19 years of knowing something and being unable to prove it looks like when the proof is finally standing in front of you at a muddy Louisiana levee in the spring. He stood there for what Cora estimated was close to 10 minutes. Opal eventually fell quiet too. The river moved. A kingfisher crossed the bend upstream and landed on the forward rail of the Evangeline Clare, and sat there for a moment and then was gone. When Aldous finally turned to look at Cora, he had the expression of a man who has been waiting for something for so long that the arrival of it does not feel like relief so much as the completion of a sum. He said, "I locked those documents myself. I was not certain anyone would think to look." Cora said, "The purser's cabin stayed dry." He said, "I knew it would. I chose the location deliberately. She had guessed that. She had thought about him as she worked through those days on the levee, this man who had been careful and honest his whole working life, and had understood, in the 2 days before the vessel's last departure, that someone intended to erase what he had documented. He had not gone to the authorities. He had not confronted the Lacroix brothers. He had put the records in the place he knew best and trusted the river to keep them and walked away. It was not bravery of a theatrical kind. It was the bravery of a person who knows exactly what the instrument in front of him is measuring and writes the number down accurately, regardless of what anyone else says it should read. He testified before the Carriers Association Board in New Orleans 6 weeks later. The proceeding was held in a room on the second floor of a commercial building on Common Street, a narrow room with tall windows that admitted the sound of the street below and the smell of river mud that was never entirely absent from New Orleans in any weather. Cora attended and sat in the second row of chairs behind the board's table, beside Opal Ferris, who sat with her hands folded and did not speak during the proceeding, but whose stillness carried the weight of someone who has waited a long time and intends to be present for every word. Aldous Ferris gave his account from the chair at the end of the table, speaking in the same careful, measured cadence that his handwriting implied. Each fact named once, in order, without embellishment. He described the figures. He described the parallel ledgers. He described the letters he had written and the silence that answered them. He described his decision to file the documents aboard the vessel and his reasons for selecting the purser's cabin. He was precise about all of it, the way a man is precise when he has been going over something in his own mind for 19 years and has had sufficient time to identify exactly which details matter. None of the board members interrupted him. Holland had told Cora beforehand that this was unusual. She took it as a measure of what Ferris's testimony looked like to people who were hearing it for the first time. Holland sat to her left during the proceeding and once, briefly, said in a low voice that the Trust's counsel expected recoverable claims for 9 of the 41 consignors whose successors were still active and had legal standing. She asked what that amounted to. He said, in aggregate, somewhere near $4,000 with interest arguable. She thought about the 41 names on Aldous Ferris's list. She thought about the 32 for whom recovery was no longer possible, absorbed by time into the general silence of things that had been taken and never returned. She thought about what Ferris had been carrying for 19 years, which was not the specific sum but the knowledge that the sum existed and had been wrongly taken, and that he could not prove it without the documents he had left aboard a sunken vessel. Now he could. The board's proceedings took 4 months. Cora had returned to Shreveport before the first session was concluded, traveling back by the same wagon and rail route she had come south by, with the certified inventory in her satchel and the oilcloth bundle no longer under her arm. The bundle had been delivered to Holland the morning before she left, in exchange for a receipt that she folded and placed in her notebook alongside the figures she had copied in the purser's cabin. She had also filed at the Pelican Parish Land Office the original transfer receipt for the vessel, properly notarized, together with a written surrender of ownership back to the parish for disposition. She had bought the Evangeline Clare for $40 and spent 3 days aboard her and recovered what she came for. She did not need to own a sunken vessel, and she did not intend to make a profit from what she had found inside one. Back in Shreveport, she returned to the steam laundry and the drive belt and the gauges, which were unchanged and unremarkable, and required of her exactly the kind of steady, methodical attention she had always given them. She took on 2 smaller consulting commissions in that period, one for a sawmill in Mansfield that was losing pressure it could not account for, and one for a grain elevator operator whose boiler flue was exhibiting the early signatures of a particular kind of corrosion her father had shown her how to diagnose. She wrote up her findings in both cases in the same careful, factual language Aldous Ferris had used in his ledgers. The condition observed, the measurements taken, the probable cause, the recommended action. She was careful with her money. She read the shipping registers when she could, the habit being too old and too useful to abandon simply because she had found what she had been looking for in one of them. In November, she received a letter from the Carriers Association, enclosing the certified copy of the purser's ledgers she had requested, with a covering note from Holland informing her that 7 of the 9 active claims had been settled in the consignor's favor, the other 2 having withdrawn following a question of succession documentation. The total recovery, he wrote, was $3,640, distributed among the 7 parties. Aldous Ferris had received a letter of formal acknowledgement from the board, recognizing his role in documenting the original discrepancy. She read the letter twice. She set it on the kitchen table next to her father's notebooks and her copper gauges and the narrow-lipped purser's ledger she had been granted as part of the certified copy, its pages still carrying the faint smell of a sealed room and the ghost of the river that had kept it. She thought about her father showing her how to read a gauge when she was 9 years old, his finger tracing the arc of the dial, and his voice patient and steady, saying, "The number you see is not your opinion of the number. The number you see is the number. You write it down exactly." She thought about Aldous Ferris reading his own figures, again and again, aboard a vessel he knew was going to be lost, and writing them down exactly, and leaving them for the river. She thought about the Evangeline Clare tilted into the Atchafalaya mud with the silt packed around her hull and the water pressing past, and the purser's cabin with its bolted shelving and its brass pelican paperweight tarnished to gold green, and the air that came out of that open doorway not smelling of rot, but of dust and old paper, and the faint trace of linseed oil, the smell of something that had waited a very long time in a sealed place and had not given way. There are things the river takes and things it keeps. You cannot always know in advance which it will do with a given object or a given truth. You can only put what you know somewhere dry and trust that the right instrument, in the right hands, will read it accurately when the time comes. Cora Vane put the letter in her file. She put the gauges back in their flannel wrapping. She opened her father's notebook to the page she had marked, the one where he had noted in his own careful hand the principles of pressure reading and gauge calibration. And she turned to the next blank page and took up her pen and began. What did Aldous Ferris carry for 19 years, knowing the record existed and waiting for someone to find it? Leave your answer below. And if this kind of story is one you press play for on a long evening, there is another one waiting just behind this.